Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The day I found Claire's phone in the car was a day like any other, or so I thought. We were on a road trip, one of those weekend getaways she insisted would bring us closer. Little did I know, the cracks in our foundation were already deep and widening, hidden under layers of well-rehearsed excuses. We'd stopped at a Wawa for coffee, and as she dashed inside, her phone lit up with a message. I wouldn't have noticed if it hadn't vibrated against the cup holder, catching my attention in that quiet moment. Normally, I'd leave it be, respecting her privacy like any husband should. But this time, something stopped me. It was just, sitting there, flashing with that blue light. I glanced over, not out of suspicion but out of instinct, and read the preview. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again tomorrow. The words blurred as I felt my pulse quicken. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, that it was innocent, maybe a joke with a friend. But in my gut, I knew better. My fingers hovered over the screen. I took a breath, lifted her phone, and unlocked it, feeling as though I was crossing a line I couldn't come back from. The messages between Claire and David, office supplies, scrolled up before me, each one more damning than the last. Photos, late-night texts, emojis I hadn't seen her use with me in years. I sat back, the weight of realization sinking into my chest like a stone. As she walked back to the car, I tucked her phone away, my hands cool and steady despite the storm brewing inside me. I watched her sip her coffee, her carefree smile twisting the knife a little deeper. I drove us back, silent, knowing I couldn't confront her just yet. I needed proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof. It wasn't enough to know, I needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal. The days that followed became a test of my patience and restraint. I was a silent investigator, going through every detail with precision. I tracked her messages, noting the times and locations she claimed to be at work, cross-referencing every lie with the truth I found on her phone. She was careful, too careful, locking her phone, hiding her messages, and keeping her lies tight and secure. But I knew her too well, and over the years, I'd noticed patterns she probably thought I hadn't. Our relationship had started off with such promise. Claire had been a bright light in my life, someone who brought laughter and spontaneity where I often brought quiet and order. But over time, that same spark had turned to something else, a quiet contempt, a hidden restlessness that I had ignored, hoping it would pass. Now, I was seeing her for who she truly was, the double life she'd been living right under my nose. I'd been a fool, blind to the late nights, the sudden phone calls, the business trips with no details. I blamed myself for not seeing it sooner, for trusting her with a loyalty she clearly didn't deserve. I knew I couldn't just confront her and watch her deny everything. That would be too easy for her, and it would leave me with nothing. No, I needed to ensure that when I acted, it was final. There would be no reconciliation, no apologies that could smooth over the jagged edges of her deceit. I began collecting evidence in the background, saving messages and taking screenshots. I became a shadow, moving in the periphery of her life, observing every slip, every moment she thought she was safe. It was as though I had already divorced her in my mind, seeing her as a stranger who had stolen something precious from me. The day I discovered their next rendezvous, my decision solidified. She was meeting him at a nearby motel, a place that held none of the pretense of her usual business trips. I checked in as well, using an alias, and spent the evening waiting in the dimly lit hallway, my heart pounding as I heard her laughter echoing down the hall. I could barely recognize her voice, bright and carefree, so unlike the cold and dismissive tone she'd used with me for months. I took photos, recorded snippets of conversation, capturing every damning moment. This was going to be all the evidence I needed. In the quiet of our house, I kept up the charade, playing the part of the doting husband while she went on living her double life. I could see her watching me sometimes, almost as if she suspected something, but I kept my calm. Inside, though, I was planning my exit strategy, preparing for the day when I would finally lay my cards on the table. She had no idea that the very foundation of her life was crumbling beneath her, inch by inch, until there would be nothing left for her to cling to. That morning, when she finally noticed something was off, I almost smiled. It was as if she sensed her time was up, that I was slipping away from her grasp. She was starting to panic, asking questions, trying to reconnect with me, as though she could fix what was broken. But it was too late. I was already gone. I was a man with a mission, and nothing was going to stop me from seeing it through. I didn't just want her to know that I knew. I wanted her to feel the emptiness, the loss, the bitter cold of betrayal that she had forced on me. And when the time came, I would deliver that final blow, calmly, with the same measured precision I'd employed in gathering my evidence. This was my stage, and the final curtain was about to fall. I watched her closely over the next few days, noting every movement, every little detail of her routine. Claire was good at hiding things, but she wasn't flawless. There were slips, small moments that betrayed the truth she was working so hard to conceal. I could tell she was beginning to suspect something, maybe the way my gaze lingered a little too long, or the way I'd become suddenly attentive to things I once ignored. Yet, she kept up her charade, confident that whatever walls she'd built around her secrets would hold. One evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, I noticed her phone, casually placed face down next to her plate. It buzzed once, and her eyes darted down, then back to me, a quick, involuntary flicker. I saw her face stiffen for just a second before she forced a smile, quickly silencing the phone and returning her attention to her food. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone light, curious. Her lips tightened, barely noticeable, but I caught it. She nodded, feigning casualness. "Yeah, just work stuff." She was lying, and we both knew it. But I played along, smiling back with practiced ease. I'd become a master of deception, a necessary survival tactic I'd picked up over the years. If she could lie to me with such ease, then I could do the same right back. The next morning, I put the finishing touches on my plan. She'd left for work, her usual busy morning routine complete with the well-practiced "see you later," and a distracted wave. I waited until she was out the door before heading into the home office, unlocking my desk drawer and pulling out a folder labeled simply, "Evidence." Inside were photos, printouts of text messages, call logs, all the proof I'd need to make sure this confrontation ended on my terms. The hardest part was keeping up the charade as I went through our usual routines, keeping my emotions in check as I faced her day in and day out. I'd mastered every possible expression, every little gesture that would keep her from seeing the turmoil brewing underneath. I couldn't allow her a glimpse of what I was planning, I couldn't risk her finding out. Every evening, I watched her as she sat scrolling through her phone, occasionally smiling to herself, sometimes laughing softly. The sound of her laughter, once a source of warmth for me, now only served as a bitter reminder of the secrets she held. But I knew it would all be over soon. Finally, on a Friday morning, I set the trap. I knew she'd planned a meeting with David that evening. I knew which hotel, which room, the time. Everything was in place. She'd told me the night before that she was going to be working late. She even kissed me before bed, as if the gesture would somehow absolve her of the lies. As I watched her, I could almost see the layers of deceit, like armor wrapped tightly around her. But I knew I was about to strip that armor away, piece by piece, until she was left exposed to the truth. When she left for work, I followed a few minutes later, stopping by the hotel she'd booked. I'd already reserved the adjacent room the day before, ensuring I'd have a perfect view of her little rendezvous. It was just after 5 when I saw her arrive, dressed in a way that made it clear this wasn't any ordinary business meeting. Her face lit up as David walked in, the two of them laughing as they made their way into the hotel room. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on the task at hand. I watched through the peephole, recording every second on my phone, capturing their interactions, the stolen glances, the moments that would later serve as the nails in the coffin of our marriage. They were in there for hours, and I stayed, waiting, recording, taking in every detail. When they finally emerged, her hair disheveled, her lipstick smudged, I felt a sick satisfaction knowing that every moment was documented. There was no going back now. She'd built her fortress of lies, and now I held the wrecking ball. I returned home before her, setting the stage for the final confrontation. I'd arranged every piece of evidence neatly on the dining room table, laid out like a presentation. There were photos, printouts of messages, call logs, receipts, all the evidence meticulously organized. I wanted her to see the life she'd constructed crumble before her eyes. When she walked through the door later that night, I greeted her with a calm smile. She seemed startled, perhaps because she wasn't used to me waiting up for her. "You're up late," she said, her voice carrying an edge of nervousness. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit down at the table. "We need to talk, Claire." She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the folder on the table, then back to me. I could see the fear in her eyes, the dawning realization that her secrets were about to be laid bare. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice unsteady. I could hear the tremor in her words, could see the way her hands shook as she reached for the first photo. It was a shot of her and David, taken at the hotel, their bodies close, their expressions unmistakable. She froze, her face paling as she flipped through the pages, each one a new piece of evidence, a new crack in her carefully constructed facade. "This," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "is what you've done to us." She didn't speak, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find the words. But there were no excuses left. The lies she'd clung to, the stories she'd crafted, they were all unraveling in front of her. She tried to speak, to explain, but I silenced her with a wave of my hand. "Don't bother, Claire. I don't want your excuses. I just want you to understand what you've done." I watched as the realization hit her, as she saw the full scope of her betrayal reflected back at her in every photo, every message. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, guilt, perhaps, or maybe just fear. But I felt no sympathy, no pity. Only the cold satisfaction of seeing her finally stripped of the lies she'd wrapped herself in. "I want you out," I said, my voice steady. "Tonight." She looked at me, shock etched across her face, as if she hadn't expected me to follow through. But I was done playing the fool. I'd already arranged for the locks to be changed, the paperwork to be filed. This was the end of the line. As she gathered her things, her face a mask of disbelief, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I'd made my peace with the end of our marriage, with the knowledge that the life we'd built together was gone, shattered by her betrayal. I watched her walk out the door, her shoulders slumped, her steps slow. And when the door closed behind her, I felt lighter, as if a weight I'd carried for years had finally been lifted. I turned back to the empty house, the silence echoing around me. It was over. The days after Claire's departure were surreal, quieter than I could have imagined. I went through the motions, work, errands, phone calls to arrange logistics for the separation. But in every empty room, I could feel the weight of the years we'd spent together, each piece of furniture, each photo on the wall a reminder of a life that had shattered in an instant. Even with the calm resolve that had steadied me through our final confrontation, there was no denying the hollow ache that now lingered in the house. Friends and family, of course, started to catch on quickly. Claire's absence raised questions. When her own friends began reaching out to me, I realized she hadn't told anyone yet. Perhaps she was still processing, trying to understand how everything had unraveled so swiftly. It wasn't my responsibility to fill them in, so I kept my answers vague, deflecting the questions and sympathies that were bound to arise. The first weekend alone was the hardest. I'd grown used to Claire's routines, the sound of her voice filtering through our home as she chatted on the phone or played music in the kitchen. Now, the silence was my only company. I tried to distract myself, to fill the quiet with work, but the memories had a way of creeping in. I thought back to the early years of our marriage, to the moments when everything had felt so effortless, so full of promise. And in those memories, I could almost convince myself that the last few months had been a bad dream. One evening, I found myself staring at the pile of documents on the coffee table, remnants of the confrontation I'd orchestrated. Every photo, every printed message was a piece of evidence, but now, with Claire gone, they felt more like pieces of a life I wanted to leave behind. I gathered them up and stashed them in the back of my desk drawer. I didn't need reminders of what she'd done. The memory of it was already seared into my mind. Then, one evening, a week after she'd left, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but a part of me knew it was her before I even answered. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, before finally pressing accept. "Hello," I said, keeping my tone neutral. There was a pause on the other end, a shaky intake of breath. "It's me. Claire." Hearing her voice again was strange, like a ghost from a life I'd left behind. I stayed silent, waiting for her to speak. I wanted to talk," she said softly. "About what happened. About us. There is no us anymore, Claire." My voice was sharper than I'd intended, but I couldn't help it. "You made sure of that?" She didn't respond for a long moment. I could almost hear her struggle to find the right words, the careful, measured way she spoke when she was trying to convince me of something. But this time, I wasn't in the mood for her excuses. "I'm not calling to make excuses," she said, as if reading my mind. I wanted to apologize. To explain." I closed my eyes, forcing myself to remain calm. "There's nothing you can say, Claire. You made your choices. You built this mess. And now, you're living with the consequences." "I know that," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know I messed up, but I need you to understand, it wasn't because I didn't love you. I did, and I still do. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what we had. I let myself believe that I needed something else, something more. I was wrong, and I see that now." I felt a rush of anger and bitterness surge up, but I kept my voice steady. "You threw everything away, Claire. For what? A fling with a man who didn't care about you the way I did?" She inhaled sharply, and I heard her swallow, her voice trembling as she responded. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant for things to go this far." I bit back the retort on my lips, forcing myself to breathe slowly. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Claire. Sorry doesn't erase the betrayal. It doesn't undo the damage." There was a long silence, one that stretched so thin I wondered if she'd hung up. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if it means anything to you, but I ended it with him. The affair. It's over." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. She was telling me now, as if it would somehow change things, as if it would soften the blow. But I couldn't summon any sympathy, not anymore. "That's too little, too late," I replied flatly. "I've moved on, Claire. I suggest you do the same." She sniffed, and I could hear the tears in her voice, the quiet, desperate sound of someone trying to hold on to something already lost. "Please, can we talk? In person? One last time?" I hesitated, a part of me wanting to say yes, to see her face one last time, to watch the realization of what she'd lost play across her features. But I knew it would be an empty victory. It wouldn't give me the closure I thought I needed. So I took a deep breath and said, "No, Claire. There's nothing left to say." She let out a shuddering breath, and I knew, in that moment, she understood. She whispered a final, broken, goodbye, and the line went silent. I set the phone down, feeling a strange sense of relief, mixed with an unexpected pang of sadness. It was really over. Every last tie had been cut, and I was free. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild, slowly, piece by piece. I redecorated the house, rearranging furniture, taking down photos, reclaiming the space as my own. Friends reached out, inviting me out for dinners, drinks, events I'd always brushed off as unimportant before. I found myself saying yes more often, realizing that maybe I needed to rebuild not just my home, but my life. One evening, as I sat on the back porch, a glass of whiskey in hand, I looked out at the sunset painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and pink. There was a peace that settled over me, a quiet contentment I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I felt like I could finally let go of the anger, the bitterness. Claire's betrayal had marked me, but it wouldn't define me. I was ready to move forward. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a new chapter beginning, one that was mine alone to write. Over the next few months, life started to settle into a steady rhythm. I began to find comfort in the simplicity of being on my own. There was a surprising freedom in solitude, a peace that I hadn't felt in years. I spent more time outdoors, hiking trails I'd once only driven past, or sitting on the porch and watching the stars. I'd even reconnected with old friends, the ones I'd drifted away from during the years of marriage. Things were starting to feel like they were falling back into place, piece by piece. Then, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Hello," I said, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. There was a hesitation on the other end, and then a voice I recognized, though much shakier than I remembered. "Mr. Sanderson?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. "Yes, speaking," I replied, now fully alert. I don't know how to say this," she started, her words catching. "My name is Sarah. I'm Claire's sister." I hadn't spoken to Claire's family since everything had happened. Most of them had sided with her, assuming I was the one who had somehow failed her, even though they didn't know the full story. Hearing from one of them now, especially her sister, was strange and unexpected. "What's going on, Sarah?" I asked, a heavy feeling settling into my stomach. There was a long pause, and then she sighed. "It's Claire. She was in an accident." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat down, feeling the weight of it immediately but unable to find the words to respond. "She was driving late last night," Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "The police said she swerved to avoid a deer, and she lost control. She was airlifted to the hospital, but," her voice cracked, and I heard a quiet sob on the other end. I closed my eyes, feeling a sudden, overwhelming rush of memories, our wedding day, vacations, nights spent laughing, all those years that, despite everything, had once felt whole. Even after all she'd done, the thought of her gone was almost unbearable. She was part of me, whether I liked it or not. I sat there, stunned, as the reality sank in. "Is she?" I struggled to finish the sentence. "She's in a coma," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "They don't know if she'll wake up. I thought you should know." I thanked her, though I could barely hear myself say the words, and hung up. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the walls, the quiet of the house suddenly feeling suffocating. The following day, I drove to the hospital, feeling strange about my decision, but needing some kind of closure. When I entered her room, the sight of her lying there, pale and still, struck me like a blow. She looked so small, so fragile, her face devoid of the confident expression she'd always worn. I sat down beside her bed, unsure of what to feel. Anger? Sadness? Regret? It all twisted inside me, impossible to untangle. I found myself reaching for her hand, clasping it gently. I'd hated her for what she'd done, for the betrayal that had torn my life apart, but sitting here now, I realized how pointless it all was. No amount of resentment would change the past or make any of this easier. For days, I kept coming back. I'd sit by her bed, talking to her, apologizing for the things I hadn't done, the words I hadn't said. I confessed to her my anger, my pain, even my lingering love, feeling that she could hear me somehow, that maybe, somewhere, she understood. One evening, a few weeks into her coma, the doctor pulled me aside. His expression was gentle but grave. "Mr. Sanderson," he said softly, "we've done all we can. There's no brain activity, and we don't expect her condition to improve." The words felt hollow, like an echo of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I nodded, numb, and agreed to let them end her life support, feeling a sharp, bitter ache take hold of me. It was as if I'd lost her twice, once to her betrayal and once now, to a fate I couldn't fight. The day they turned off the machines, I stayed by her side, holding her hand as her breathing slowed, then stilled. A part of me felt like I was dying with her, that the life we'd built, the dreams we'd once shared, were slipping away with her final breath. I stayed until the room was silent, the beeping of the machines replaced by an unbearable, hollow quiet. Afterward, I went home, feeling lost, unsure of how to continue. The house felt different now, emptier, even more silent than it had in those early days after she'd left. It felt like I was floating, unanchored, drifting between grief and memories, haunted by the years we'd shared and the ending I hadn't expected. Months passed, and though I tried to move on, the sadness clung to me, a ghost I couldn't shake. I went through the motions, putting on a brave face for friends and family, but inside, I felt hollow. I'd lost my future and my past, the bitter satisfaction of revenge replaced by an aching void. I knew I'd never forget her, and I knew, too, that some scars would never fully heal. I'd loved her, once, with everything I had, and that love, even in the face of betrayal, had never truly left me. And now, I would carry the weight of that loss, that sorrow, for the rest of my life. In the end, she was gone, but her memory would live on, a reminder of the beautiful, broken story we'd shared and the life that had slipped away, as fragile and fleeting as a whisper in the dark.